Daphne decided the best strategy was simply to ignore his churlish mood. In just a moment, Anthony, she said sweetly. Mother has asked me to fetch a vase. Hastings has brought her flowers. Hastings is here? Anthony looked past her to the duo further in the room. What are you doing here, Hastings? Calling on your sister. Anthony pushed past Daphne and strode into the room, looking rather like a thundercloud on legs. I did not give you leave to court my sister, he bellowed. I did, Violet said. She shoved the flowers in Anthony's face, wiggling them so as to deposit the greatest amount of pollen on his nose. Aren't these lovely? Anthony sneezed and pushed them aside. Mother, I am trying to have a conversation with the Duke. Violet looked at Simon. Do you want to have this conversation with my son? Not particularly. Fine then, Anthony. Be quiet. Daphne clapped her hand over her mouth, but a snuffly, giggly sound escaped nonetheless. You, Anthony jabbed a finger in her direction. Be quiet. Perhaps I should fetch that vase, Daphne mused, and leave me to the tender mercies of your brother? Simon said in a mild voice. I think not. Daphne raised a brow. Do you imply that you are not man enough to handle him? Nothing of the sort. Merely that he ought to be your problem, not mine, and what the hell is going on here? Anthony roared. Anthony! Violet exclaimed. I will not tolerate such unbecoming language in my drawing room. Daphne smirked. Simon did nothing more than cock his head, regarding Anthony with a curious stare. Anthony threw a dark scowl at both of them before turning his attention to his mother. He is not to be trusted. Do you have any idea what is happening here? He demanded. Of course I do, Violet replied. The Duke is paying a call upon your sister. And I brought flowers for your mother, Simon said helpfully. Anthony gazed longingly at Simon's nose. Simon had the distinct impression that Anthony was imagining smashing it in. Anthony whipped his head around to face his mother. Do you understand the extent of his reputation? Reformed rakes make the best husbands, Violet said. Rubbish, and you know it. He's not a true rake, anyway, Daphne added. The look Anthony shot at his sister was so comically malevolent, Simon nearly laughed. He managed to restrain himself, but mostly just because he was fairly certain that any show of humor would cause Anthony's fist to lose its battle with his brain, with Simon's face emerging as the conflict's primary casualty. You don't know, Anthony said, his voice low and nearly shaking with rage. You don't know what he has done. No more than what you have done, I'm sure, Violet said slyly. Precisely, Anthony roared. Good gosh, I know exactly what is going on in his brain right now, and it has nothing to do with poetry and roses. Simon pictured laying Daphne down on a bed of rose petals. Well, maybe roses, he murmured. I am going to kill him, Anthony announced. These are tulips, anyway, Violet said primly, from Holland. And Anthony, you really must summon control of your emotion. This is most unseemly. He is not fit to lick Daphne's boots. Simon's head filled with more erotic images, this time of himself licking her toes. He decided not to comment. Besides, he had already decided that he wasn't going to allow his thoughts to wander in such directions. Daphne was Anthony's sister, for goodness sake. He couldn't seduce her. I refuse to listen to another disparaging word about His Grace, Violet said, emphatically, and that is the end of the subject. But I don't like your tone, Anthony Bridgerton. Simon thought he heard Daphne choke on a chuckle, and he wondered what that was all about. If it would please your motherhood, Anthony said in excruciatingly even tones, I would like a private word with His Grace. This time I am really going to get that vase, Daphne announced, and dashed from the room. Violet crossed her arms and said to Anthony, I will not have you mistreat a guest in my house. I shan't lay so much as a hand on him, Anthony replied. I give you my word. Having never had a mother, Simon was finding this exchange fascinating. Bridgerton House was, after all, technically Anthony's house, not his mother's, and Simon was impressed that Anthony had refrained from pointing this out. It's quite all right, Lady Bridgerton, he interjected. I'm sure Anthony and I have much to discuss. Anthony's eyes narrowed. Much. Very well, Violet said. You're going to do what you want no matter what I say anyway, but I am not leaving. She plopped down onto the sofa. This is my drawing room, and I am comfortable here. If the two of you want to engage in that asinine interchange that passes for conversation among the males of your species, you may do so elsewhere. Simon blinked in surprise. Clearly, there was more to Daphne's mother than met the eye. Anthony jerked his head toward the door, and Simon followed him into the hall. My study is this way, Anthony said. You have a study here? I am the head of the family. Of course, Simon allowed, but you do reside elsewhere. Anthony paused and turned an assessing stare on Simon. It cannot have escaped your notice that my position as head of the Bridgerton family carries with it serious responsibilities. Simon looked him evenly in the eye. Meaning Daphne? Precisely. If I recall, Simon said, earlier this week you told me you wanted to introduce us. That was before I thought you'd be interested in her. Simon held his tongue as he preceded Anthony into the study, remaining silent until Anthony shut the door. Why, he asked softly, would you assume I would not be interested in your sister? Besides the fact that you have sworn to me that you will never marry, Anthony drawled. He had a good point. Simon hated that he had such a good point. Besides that, he snapped. Anthony blinked a couple of times and then said, no one is interested in Daphne, at least no one we'd have her marry. Simon crossed his arms and leaned back against the wall. You don't hold her in terribly high regard, do you? Before he could even finish the query, Anthony had him by the throat. Don't you dare insult my sister. But Simon had learned quite a bit about self-defense on his travels, and it took him only 2 seconds to reverse their position. I wasn't insulting your sister, he said in a malevolent voice. I was insulting you. Strange gurgling sounds were coming from Anthony's throat. So Simon let him go. As it happens, he said, brushing his hands against each other, Daphne explained to me why she has not attracted any suitable suitors. Oh? Anthony asked derisively. Personally, I think it has everything to do with your and your brother's ape-like ways, but she tells me it is because all London views her as a friend, and none sees her as a romantic heroine. Anthony was silent for a long moment before saying, I see. Then, after another pause, he added thoughtfully, she's probably right. Simon said nothing, just watched his friend as he sorted all of this out. Finally, Anthony said, I still don't like your sniffing about her. Good heavens, you make me sound positively canine. Anthony crossed his arms. Don't forget, we ran in the same pack after we left Oxford. I know exactly what you've done. Oh, for the love of Christ, Bridgerton, we were 20. All men are idiots at that age. Besides, you know damn well that Simon felt his tongue grow awkward, and faked a coughing fit to cover his stammer. Damn. This happened so infrequently these days, but when it did, it was always when he was upset or angry. If he lost control over his emotions, he lost control over his speech. It was as simple as that. And unfortunately, episodes such as this one only served to make him upset and angry with himself, which in turn exacerbated the stammer. It was the worst sort of a vicious cycle. Anthony looked at him quizzically. Are you all right? Simon nodded. Just a bit of dust in my throat, he lied. Shall I ring for tea? Simon nodded again. He didn't particularly want tea, but it seemed the sort of thing one would ask for if one truly did have dust in one's throat. Anthony tugged at the bell pull, then turned back to Simon and asked, You were saying? Simon swallowed, hoping the gesture would help him to regain control over his ire. I merely meant to point out that you know better than anyone that at least half of my reputation is undeserved. Yes, but I was there for the half that was deserved, and while I don't mind your occasionally socializing with Daphne, I don't want you courting her. Simon stared at his friend, or at least the man he thought was his friend, in disbelief. Do you really think I'd seduce your sister? I don't know what to think. I know you plan never to marry. I know that Daphne does. Anthony shrugged. Frankly, that's enough for me to keep you two on opposite sides of the dance floor. Simon let out a long breath. While Anthony's attitude was irritating as hell, he supposed it was understandable and in fact even laudable. After all, the man was only acting in the best interests of his sister. Simon had a difficulty imagining being responsible for anyone save himself, but he supposed that if he had a sister, he'd be damned picky about who courted her as well. Just then a knock sounded at the door. Enter, Anthony called out. Instead of the maid with tea, Daphne slipped into the room. Mother told me that the two of you are in a beastly moods, and I should leave you alone, but I thought I ought to make certain neither of you had killed the other. No, Anthony said with a grim smile. Just a tight strangle. Light strangle. To Daphne's credit, she didn't bat an eyelash. Who strangled whom? I strangled him, her brother replied. Then he returned the favor. I see, she said slowly. I'm sorry to have missed the entertainment. Simon couldn't suppress a smile at her remark. Daph, he began. Anthony whirled around. You call her Daph? His head snapped back to Daphne. Did you give him permission to use your given name? Of course. But I think, Simon interrupted, that we are going to have to come clean. Daphne nodded somberly. I think you're right. If you recall, I told you so. How genteel of you to mention it, Simon murmured. She smiled gamely. I could not resist. With four brothers, after all, one must always seize the moment when one may say, I told you so. Simon looked from sibling to sibling. I don't know which one of you I pity more. What the devil is going on? Simon Anthony demanded, and then added as an aside, and as for your remark, pity me, I am a far more amiable brother than she is a sister. Not true. Simon ignored the squabble and focused his attention on Anthony. You want to know what the devil is going on? It's like this. Men are sheep. Where one goes, the rest will soon follow. Lady Whistledown's Society Papers, April 30th, 1813. All in all, Daphne thought, Anthony was taking this rather well. By the time Simon had finished explaining their little plan, with, she had to admit, frequent interruptions on her part, Anthony had raised his voice only 7 times. That was about 7 fewer than Daphne would have predicted. Finally, after Daphne begged him to hold his tongue until she and Simon were done with their story, Anthony gave a curt nod, crossed his arms, and clamped his mouth shut for the duration of the explanation. His frown was enough to shake the plaster off the walls, but, true to his word, he remained utterly silent until Simon finished with, and that's that. There was silence, dead silence. For a full 10 seconds, nothing but silence, although Daphne would have sworn she could hear her eyes moving in their sockets as they darted back from Anthony to Simon, and then finally from Anthony. Are you mad? I thought this might be his reaction, Daphne murmured. Are you both completely irrevocably, abominably insane? Anthony's voice rose to a roar. I don't know which of you is more clearly the idiot. Will you hush? Daphne hissed. Mother will hear you. Mother will perish of heart failure if she knew what you were about, Anthony retorted, but he did use a softer tone. But Mother is not going to hear of it, is she? Daphne shot back. No, she's not, Anthony replied, his chin jutting forward, because your little scheme is finished as of this very moment. Daphne crossed her arms. You can't do anything to stop me. Anthony jerked his head toward Simon. I can kill him. Don't be ridiculous. Duels have been fought for less by idiots. I'm not disputing the title as regards to him. If I might interrupt, Simon said quietly. He's your best friend, Daphne protested. Not, Anthony said, the single syllable brimming with barely contained violence. Any more? Daphne turned to Simon with a huff. Aren't you going to say anything? His lips quirked into an amused half-smile. And when would I have had the chance? Anthony turned to Simon. I want you out of this house. Before I may defend myself? It's my house too, Daphne said hotly, and I want him to stay. Anthony glared at his sister, exasperation evident in every inch of his posture. Very well, he said. I'll give you 2 minutes to state your case, no more. Daphne glanced hesitantly at Simon, wondering if he'd want to use the 2 minutes himself. but all he did was shrug and say, "Go right ahead, he's your brother." She took a fortifying breath, planted her hands on her hips without even realizing it, and said, "First of all, I must point out that I have far more to gain from this alliance than his grace. He says he wishes to use me to keep the other women." "And their mothers," Simon interrupted, "and their mothers at bay. But frankly," Daphne glanced at Simon as she said this, "I think he's wrong. The women aren't going to stop pursuing him just because they think he might have formed an attachment with another young lady, especially when that young lady is me." "And what is wrong with you?" Anthony demanded. Daphne started to explain, but then she caught a strange glance pass between the two men. What was that all about? "Nothing," Anthony muttered, looking a trifle sheepish. "I explained to your brother your theory on why you have not had more suitors," Simon said gently. "I see." Daphne pursed her lips as she tried to decide whether that was something she ought to be irritated about. Hmm. Well, he should have figured that out on his own. Simon made an odd snorting sound that might have been a laugh. Daphne leveled a sharp look at both men. "I do hope my 2 minutes do not include all of those interruptions." Simon shrugged. "He's a timekeeper." Anthony clutched at the edge of the desk, probably, Daphne thought, to keep himself from going for Simon's throat. "And he said menacingly, "is going to find himself headfirst through the goddamn window if he doesn't shut up." "Did you know I have always suspected that men were idiots?" Daphne ground out. "But I was never positive until today." Simon grinned. "Allowing for interruptions," Anthony bit off, shooting yet another deadly glare in Simon's direction, even as he spoke to Daphne. "You have 1.5 minutes left." "Fine," she snapped. "Then I'll reduce this conversation to one single fact. Today I had 6 callers. 6! Can you recall the last time I had 6 callers?" Anthony just stared at her blankly. "I can't," Daphne continued, in the fine form now, because it has never happened. 6 men marched up our steps, knocked on our door, and gave Humboldt their cards. 6 men brought me flowers, engaged me in conversation, and one even recited poetry." Simon winced. "And do you know why?" she demanded, her voice rising dangerously. "Do you?" Anthony, in his somewhat belatedly arrived wisdom, held his tongue. "It is all because she jabbed her forefinger towards Simon, "was kind enough to feign interest in me last night at Lady Danbury's ball." Simon, who had been leaning casually against the edge of the desk, suddenly straightened. "Well, now," he said quickly, "I wouldn't quite put it that way." She turned to him, her eyes remarkably steady. "And how would you put it?" He didn't get much past "I" before she added, "Because I can assure you those men have never seen fit to call on me before." "If they are so myopic," Simon said quietly, "why do you care for their regard?" She fell silent, drawing back slightly. Simon had the sinking suspicion that he might have said something very, very wrong, but he wasn't positive until he saw her blinking rapidly. Oh, damn. Then she wiped one of her eyes. She coughed as she did it, trying to hide the maneuver by pretending to cover her mouth, but Simon still felt like the worst sort of heel. "Now look what you've done," Anthony snapped. He placed a comforting hand on his sister's arm, all the while glaring at Simon. "Pay him no mind, Daphne. He's an ass." Maybe, she sniffled, but he's an intelligent ass. Anthony's mouth fell open. She shot him a testy look. Well, if you didn't want me to repeat it, you shouldn't have said it. Anthony let out a weary sigh. Were there really 6 men here this afternoon? She nodded. 7, including Hastings. And, he asked carefully, were any of them men you might be interested in marrying? Simon realized that his fingers were gouging small holes in his thigh and forced himself to move his hand to the desk. Daphne nodded again. They are all men with whom I have enjoyed a previous friendship. It is only that they never viewed me as a candidate for romance before Hastings led the way. I might, if given the opportunity, develop an attachment for one of them. But Simon quickly shut his mouth. But what? Daphne asked, turning to him with curious eyes. It occurred to him that what he wanted to say was that if those men had only noticed Daphne's charms because a duke had shown interest in her, then they were idiots, and thus she shouldn't even contemplate marrying them. But considering that he had been the one to originally point out that his interest would gain her more suitors, well, frankly, it seemed a bit self-defeating to mention it. Nothing, he finally said, raising a hand in a don't mind me motion. It doesn't signify. Daphne looked at him for a few moments, as if waiting for him to change his mind, and then turned back to her brother. Do you admit to the wisdom of our plan, then? Wisdom might be a bit of a stretch, but Anthony looked pained to say it. I can see where you might think it might benefit you. Anthony, I have to find a husband. Besides the fact that mother is pestering me to death, I want a husband. I want to marry and have a family of my own. I want it more than you could ever know, and thus far no one acceptable has asked. Anthony had no idea. Simon had no idea how Anthony could possibly hold out against the warm pleading in her dark eyes. And sure enough, Anthony sagged against the desk and let out a weary groan. Very well, he said, closing his eyes as if he couldn't believe what he was saying. I shall agree to this if I must. Daphne jumped up and threw her arms around him. Oh, Anthony, I knew you were the very best of brothers. She gave him a kiss on the cheek. You're just occasionally misguided. Anthony's eyes floated heavenward before focusing on Simon. Do you see what I have to put up with? He asked with a shake of his head. His tone was that particular timbre used only from one beleaguered male to another. Simon chuckled to himself as he wondered when he'd turned from evil seducer back into good friend. But, Anthony said loudly, causing Daphne to back up, I am placing some conditions on this. Daphne didn't say anything, just blinked as she waited for her brother to continue. First of all, this goes no further than this room. Agreed, she said quickly. Anthony looked pointedly at Simon. Of course, he replied. Mother would be devastated if she learned the truth. Actually, Simon murmured, I rather think your mother would applaud our ingenuity, but since you have quite obviously known her longer, I bow to your discretion. Anthony shot him a frosty look. Second, under no circumstances are the two of you to be alone together, ever. Well, that should be easy, Daphne said, as we wouldn't be allowed to be alone if we were courting in truth anyway. Simon recalled their brief interlude in the hall at Lady Danbury's house, and found it a pity that he wasn't to be allowed any more private time with Daphne, but he recognized a brick wall when he saw one, especially when said wall happened to be named Anthony Bridgerton, so he just nodded and murmured his assent. Third. There is a third? Daphne asked. There would be 30 if I could think of them, Anthony growled. Very well, she acceded, looking more aggrieved. If you must. For a split second, Simon thought Anthony might strangle her. What are you laughing about? Anthony demanded. It was only then that Simon realized that he had snorted a laugh. Nothing, he said quickly. Good, Anthony grunted, because the third condition is this. If I ever, even once, catch you in any behavior that compromises her, if I ever even catch you kissing her bloody hand without a chaperone, I shall tear your head off. Daphne blinked. Don't you think that's a bit excessive? Anthony leveled a hard stare in her direction. No. Oh. Hastings? Simon had no choice but to nod. Good, Anthony replied gruffly. And now that we're done with that, you, he cocked his head rather abruptly toward Simon, can leave. Anthony, Daphne explained. I assume this means I am disinvited for supper this evening? Simon asked. Yes. No. Daphne jabbed her brother in the arm. Is Hastings invited for supper? Why did you not say something? It was days ago, Anthony grumbled. Years. It was Monday, Simon said. Well, then, you must join us, Daphne said firmly. Mother will be so delighted, and you... She poked her brother in the arm. Stop thinking about how you may poison him. Before Anthony could reply, Simon waved off her words with a chuckle. Do not worry on my behalf, Daphne. You forget that I attended school with him for nearly a decade. He never did understand the principles of chemistry. I shall kill him, Simon said to himself. Before the week is out, I shall kill him. No, you won't, Daphne said blithely. By tomorrow you will have forgotten all of this and will be smoking charots at White's. I don't think so, Anthony said ominously. Of course you will. Don't you agree, Simon? Simon studied his best friend's face and realized he was seeing something new, something in his eyes, something serious. 6 years ago, when Simon had left England, he and Anthony had been boys. Oh, they'd thought they were men. They'd gambled and whored and strutted about society, consumed with their own importance, but now they were different. Now they were men in truth. Simon had felt the change within himself during his travels. It had been a slow transformation, wrought over time, as he faced new challenges, but now he realized that he'd returned to England, still picturing Anthony as that 22-year-old boy he'd left behind. He'd done his friend a great disservice, he realized, in failing to realize that he too had grown up. Anthony had responsibilities Simon had never even dreamed of. He had brothers to guide, sisters to protect. Simon had a dukedom, but Anthony had a family. There was a grave difference, and Simon found that he couldn't fault his friend for his overprotective and indeed somewhat mullish behavior. I think, Simon said slowly, finally answering Daphne's question, that your brother and I are both different people than we were when we ran wild 6 years ago, and I think that might not be such a bad thing. Several hours later, the Bridgerton household was in chaos. Daphne had changed into an evening dress of dark green velvet that someone had once said almost made her eyes look not quite brown, and was presently idling about in the great hall, trying to find a way to calm her mother's racing nerves. I cannot believe, Violet said, one hand fluttering on her chest, that Anthony forgot to tell me he invited the Duke to dinner. I had no time to I had no time to prepare, none at all. Daphne eyed the menu in her hand, which began with turtle soup and marched through three more courses before finishing with lamb à la baccham, followed of course by a choice of four desserts. She tried to keep her voice free of sarcasm as she said, I do not think the Duke will have cause to complain. I pray that he won't, Violet replied. But if I had known he was coming, I would have made sure we had a beef dish as well. One cannot entertain without a beef dish. He knows that this is an informal dinner. Violet shot her an acerbic look. No meal is informal when a duke is calling. Daphne regarded her mother thoughtfully. Violet was wringing her hands and gnashing her teeth. Mother, Daphne said, I don't think the Duke is the sort to express us. I don't think the Duke is the sort to expect us to dramatically alter our family supper plans on his behalf. He might not expect it, Violet said, but I do. Daphne, there are certain rules in society, expectations, and frankly, I do not understand how you can be quite so calm and disinterested. I'm not disinterested. You certainly don't look nervous. Violet eyed her suspiciously. How can you not be nervous? For goodness sake, Daphne, this man is thinking of marrying you. Daphne caught herself just before she groaned. He has never said as much, Mother. He didn't have to. Why else would he have danced with you last night? The only other lady he so honored with was Penelope Featherington, and we both know that that had to be out of pity. I like Penelope, Daphne said. I like Penelope too, Violet returned, and I long for the day her mother realizes that a girl of her complexion cannot be dressed in tangerine satin. But that is beside the point. What is the point? I don't know, Violet very nearly wailed. Daphne shook her head. I'm going to find Eloise. Yes, do that, Violet said distractedly, and make sure Gregory is clean. He never washes behind his ears. And Hyacinth, goodness gracious, what are we going to do about Hyacinth? Hastings will not expect a 10-year-old at the table. Yes, he will, Daphne replied patiently. Anthony told him we were dining as a family. Most families do not allow their youngest children to dine with them, Violet pointed out. Then that is their problem. Daphne finally gave in to her exasperation and let out a loud sigh. Mother, I spoke to the Duke. He understands that this is not a formal meal, and he specifically told me that he was looking forward to a change of pace. He has no family himself, so he has never experienced anything like a Bridgerton family dinner. Gosh help us. Violet's face went utterly pale. Now, Mother, Daphne said quickly, I know what you're thinking, and I assure you that you do not have to worry about Gregory putting creamed potatoes on Francesca's chair again. I am certain he has outgrown such childish behavior. He did it last week. Well then, Daphne said briskly, not missing a beat, then I'm sure he's learned his lesson. The look Violet gave her daughter was dubious in extreme. Very well then, Daphne said, her tone considerably less businesslike. Then I will simply threaten him with death if he does anything to upset you. Death won't scare him, Violet mused, but perhaps I can threaten to sell his horse. He'll never believe you. No, you're right, I'm far too soft-hearted. Violet frowned, but he might believe me if I told him he would be forbidden to go on his daily ride. That may work, Daphne agreed. Good. I shall go off and scare some sense into him. Violet took 2 steps, then turned around. Having children is such a challenge. Daphne just smiled. She knew it was a challenge her mother adored. Violet cleared her throat softly, signaling a more serious turn of conversation. I do hope this supper goes well, Daphne. I think Hastings might be an excellent match for you. Might? Daphne teased. I thought dukes were good matches even if they had 2 heads and spicked while they talked. She laughed. One out of both mouths. Violet smiled benignly. You might find this difficult to believe, Daphne, but I don't want to see you married off to just anyone. I may introduce you to no end of eligible men, but that is only because I would like you to have as many suitors as possible from which to choose a husband. Violet smiled wistfully. It is my fondest dream to see you as happy as I was with your father. And then, before Daphne could reply, Violet disappeared down the hall, leaving Daphne with second thoughts. Maybe this plan with Hastings wasn't such a good idea after all. Violet was going to be crushed when they broke off their Fox alliance. Simon had said that Daphne might be the one to do that jilting, but she was beginning to wonder if perhaps it wouldn't be better the other way around. It would be mortifying for Daphne to be thrown over by Simon, but at least that way she wouldn't have to endure Violet's bewildered chorus of why. Violet was going to think she was insane for letting him get away, and Daphne would be left wondering if maybe her mother was right. Simon had not been prepared for supper with the Bridgertons. It was a loud, raucous affair, with plenty of laughter and, thankfully, only one incident involving a flying pea. It had looked as if the pea in question had originated at Hyacinth's end of the table, but the littlest Bridgerton had looked so innocent and angelic that Simon had difficulty believing she had actually aimed the legume at her brother. Thankfully, Violet had not noticed the flying pea, even though it sailed right over her head in a perfect arc. But Daphne, who was sitting directly across from him, most certainly had, because her napkin flew up to cover her mouth with remarkable alacrity. Judging from the way her eyes were crinkling at the corners, she was definitely laughing under the square of linen. Simon spoke little throughout the meal. Truth be told, it was far easier to listen to the Bridgertons than actually try to converse with them, especially considering the number of malevolent stares he was receiving from Anthony and Benedict. But Simon had been seated clear as at the opposite end of the table from the 2 eldest Bridgertons. No accident on Violet's part, he was sure. So it was relatively simple to ignore them and instead enjoy Daphne's interactions with the rest of her family. Every now and then, one of them would ask him a direct question, and he would answer, and then he would return to his demeanor of quiet observation. Finally, Hyacinth, who was seated to Daphne's right, looked him straight in the eye and said, "You don't talk much, do you?" Violet choked on her wine. "The Duke," Daphne said to Hyacinth, "is being far more polite than we are, constantly jumping into conversation and interrupting one another as if we're afraid we might not be heard." "I'm not afraid I might not be heard," Gregory said. "I'm not afraid of that either," Violet commented dryly. "Gregory, eat your peas." "But Hyacinth—" "Lady Bridgerton," Simon said loudly, "may I trouble you for another helping of those delicious peas?" "Why, certainly." Violet shot an arch look at Gregory. "Notice how the Duke is eating his peas?" Gregory ate his peas. Simon smiled to himself as he spooned another portion of peas onto his plate, thankfully that Lady Bridgerton had not decided to serve dinner à la Russe. It would have been difficult to stave off Gregory's certain accusation of Hyacinth as a pea tosser if he'd had to summon a footman to serve him. Simon busied himself with his peas, since he really had no choice but to finish off every last one. He stole a glance at Daphne, however, who was wearing a secret little smile. Her eyes were brimming with infectious good humor, and Simon soon felt the corners of his mouth turning up as well. "Anthony, why are you growling?" asked one of the other Bridgerton girls. Simon thought it might be Francesca, but it was hard to say. The two middle ones looked amazingly alike, right down to their light eyes, so like their mothers. "I'm not scowling," Anthony snapped, but Simon, having been on the receiving end of those scowls for the better part of an hour, rather thought he was lying. "You are too," either Francesca or Eloise said. Anthony's tone of reply was condescending in the extreme. "If you think I am going to say I'm not, you're sadly mistaken." Daphne laughed into her napkin again. Simon decided life was more amusing than it had been in ages. "Do you know," Violet suddenly announced, "that I think this might be one of the most pleasant evenings of the year? Even," she sent a knowing glance down the table at Hyacinth, "if my youngest is tossing peas down the table." Simon looked up just as Hyacinth cried out, "How did you know?" Violet shook her head as she rolled her eyes. "My dear children," she said, "when will you learn that I know everything?" Simon decided he had a great deal of respect for Violet Bridgerton, but even still she managed to completely confuse him with a question and a smile. "Tell me, Your Grace," she said, "are you busy tomorrow?" Despite her blonde and blue-eyed coloring, she looked so like Daphne as she asked him this question that he was momentarily befuddled, which had to be the only reason he didn't bother to think before he stammered, "No, not that I recall." Hold on. "No, not that I recall." Second. Sorry, guys, I had to plug in my computer. All right. Excellent, Violet exclaimed, beaming. Then you must join us on our outing to Greenwich. Greenwich? Simon echoed. Yes, we've been planning a family outing for several weeks now. We thought we'd take a boat, and then perhaps have a picnic on the shores of the Thames. Violet smiled at him confidently. You'll come, won't you? Mother, Daphne interjected, I'm certain the Duke has any number of commitments. Violet gave Daphne a look so frigid Simon was surprised that neither one of them turned to ice. Nonsense, Violet replied. He just said himself that he wasn't busy. She turned back to Simon. And we shall be visiting the Royal Observatory as well, so you needn't worry that this will be a mindless jaunt. It's not open to the public, of course, but my late husband was a great patron, so we are assured entry. Simon looked at Daphne. She just shrugged and apologized with her eyes. He turned back to Violet. I'd be delighted. Violet beamed and patted him on the arm, and Simon had the sinking sensation that his fate had just been sealed. It has reached this author's ears that the entire Bridgerton family, plus one duke, embarked upon a journey to Greenwich on Saturday. It has also reached this author's ears that the aforementioned duke, along with a certain member of the Bridgerton family, returned to London very wet indeed. Lady Whistledown, Society Paper, May 3rd, 1813. If you apologize to me one more time, Simon said, leaning his head back against his hands, I may have to kill you. Daphne shot him an irritated look from her position in her deck chair on the small yacht her mother had commissioned to take the entire family and the Duke, of course, to Greenwich. Pardon me, she said, if I am polite enough to apologize for my mother's quite obvious manipulations. I thought that the purpose of our little charade was to shield you from the tender mercies of matchmaking mothers. Simon waved off her comment as he settled deeper into his own chair. It would only be a problem if I were not enjoying myself. Daphne's chin lurched backward slightly in surprise. Oh, she said, stupidly in her opinion. That's nice. He laughed. I am inordinately fond of boat travel, even if it is just down to Greenwich. And besides, after spending so much time at sea, I rather fancy a visit to the Royal Observatory to see the Greenwich meridian. He cocked his head in her direction. Do you know much about navigation and longitude? She shook her head. Very little, I'm afraid. I must confess I am not even certain what this meridian here at Greenwich is. It's the point from which all longitude is measured. It used to be that sailors and navigators measured longitudinal distance from their point of departure, but in the last century, the astronomer royal decided to make Greenwich the starting point. Daphne raised her brows. That seems rather self-important to us, don't you think? Positioning ourselves at the center of the world. Actually, it's quite convenient to have a universal reference point when one is attempting to navigate high seas. She still looked doubtful. So everyone simply agreed on Greenwich? I find it difficult to believe that the French wouldn't have insisted upon Paris, and the Pope, I'm sure, would have preferred Rome. Well, it wasn't an agreement precisely, he allowed with a laugh. There was no official treaty, if that is what you mean. but the Royal Observatory publishes an excellent set of charts and tables each year. It's called the National Almanac, and a sailor would have to be insane to attempt to navigate the ocean without without one on board. And since the National Almanac measures longitude with Greenwich as a zero, well, everyone else has adopted it as well. You seem to know quite a bit about this. He shrugged. If you spend enough time on a ship, you learn. Well, I'm afraid it wasn't the sort of thing one learned in the Bridgerton's nursery. She caught her head to the side in a somewhat self-deprecating manner. Most of my learning was restricted to what my governess knew. Pity, he murmured. Then he asked, only most? If there was something that interested me, I could usually find several books to read on the topic in our library. I would wager, then, that your interest did not lie in abstract mathematics. Daphne laughed. Like you mean? Hardly, I am afraid. My mother always said that it was a wonder I could add high enough to put shoes on my feet. Simon winced. I know, she said, still smiling. You sorts who excel at arithmetic simply don't understand how we lesser mortals can look at a page of numbers and not know the answer, or at least how to get to the answer instantly. Colin is the same way. He smiled because she was exactly right. What then were your favorite subjects? Hmm. Oh, history and literature, which was fortunate, since we had no end of books on those topics. He took another sip of his lemonade. I've never had any great passion for history. Really? Why not, do you think? Simon pondered that for a moment, wondering if perhaps his lack of enthusiasm for history was due to his distaste for his dukedom and all the tradition that wrapped around it. His father had been so passionate about the title. But of course, all he said was, "Don't know really, just didn't like it, I suppose." They fell into a few moments of companionable silence, the gentle river wind ruffling their hair. Then Daphne smiled and said, "Well, I won't apologize again, since I'm too fond of my life to sacrifice it needlessly at your hands, but I'm glad that you're not miserable after my mother browbeat you into accompanying us." The look he gave her was vaguely sardonic. "If I hadn't wanted to join you, there's nothing your mother could have said that would have secured my presence." She snorted. "And this from a man who is feigning a courtship to me, of all people, all because he's too polite to refuse invitation from his friends' new wives?" A rather irritable scowl immediately darkened his features. "What do you mean, you of all people?" "Well, she blinked in surprise. She had no idea what she meant. "I don't know," she firmly said. "Well, stop saying it," he grumbled, then settled back into his chair. Daphne's eyes inexplicably focused on a wet spot on the railing as she fought to keep an absurd smile off her face. Simon was so sweet when he was grumpy. "What are you looking at?" he asked. Her lips twitched. "Nothing." "Then what are you smiling at?" That she most certainly was not going to reveal. "I'm not smiling." "If you're not smiling," he muttered, "then you're either about to suffer a seizure or sneeze." "Neither," she said in a breezy voice. "Just enjoying the excellent weather." Simon was leaning his head against the back of the chair, so he just rolled it to the side so he could look at her. And the company's not that bad, he teased. Daphne shot a pointed look at Anthony, who was leaning against the rail on the opposite side of the deck, glowering at both of them. All of the company? She asked. If you mean your belligerent brother, Simon replied, I am actually finding his distress most amusing. Daphne fought a smile and didn't win. That's not very kind-hearted of you. I never said I was kind. And look, Simon tipped his head ever so slightly in Anthony's direction. Anthony's scowl had, unbelievably, turned even blacker. He knows we're talking about him. It's killing him. I thought you were friends. We are friends. This is what friends do to one another.